Hi, have you ever considered maybe getting a seasonal job and working in another state or country or whatever you want to do short term? Well, there's a way to do that. It's pretty easy. I know the website I used is called coolworks.com. But let me start out by saying that I'm sharing a story about my time as a seasonal worker in Alaska. I'm originally from Missouri, and I also lived for 5 years in Washington State. Um, and I've always loved the ocean and boats. And the job that I got was in Alaska in a small town. And a lot of the job involved boats. I don't have a captain's license. I was mainly just a passenger for work and then deckhand occasionally. But there was a couple days where I did captain duties for staff, so I wasn't transporting paying passengers, and it was also completely legal. It was under the capacity limit, and so because of that, I was able to basically captain the boat, which is fine because I've had experience doing that. They trained me on how to drive the boats and control the boats and stuff like that. And for the most part, the weather was great. It was a protected bay. There wasn't a lot happening. So it was generally safe. There was this one day, and this is the story I want to talk about from my life because I have a lot of crazy stories to share. And this is probably the most insane one that I have lived through. Let me begin this story by saying there was a small craft that had capsized in Seward, which is where I was working that summer. And I think it was a smaller craft, and it was also pretty bad weather conditions. But unfortunately, everybody died, and that is very tragic. But because of that, what had happened, that story was very close to me because, it happened in the place that I lived and worked and in the same weather conditions that the story took place. So my job was remote. We had to take boats out to where I worked, and on this one particular day, there was a small craft advisory, and the weather conditions were absolutely horrible that day, even in the protected area that I worked. The wind gusts were probably like 40 to 50 knots. I have the Windy app, which tells you, and I was somewhere in the area, in the whole Bay Area, 40 to 50 knot wind gusts. And then, the general wind was still pretty strong as well. So the end of my day had come up. I think I had worked like 60 some hours that week. I was very tired and I was ready to get home. So our captain that had been working that day, he was unable to take the employee boat back. And because of that, me and my coworker, who had very little boating experience, and myself, who didn't have much more, we were the only two that were going to be heading back to home. And we had to take a small 28-foot boat that was probably not meant for seas greater than 6 feet. Like, that was the max that it could safely handle. And even that was questionable. I had been a passenger on that same boat in 6-foot waves, and it was foggy, and that we just kept getting green water, which is where the waves crash over the windows and you can't see anything. Thankfully that day I was not the captain, I was just a passenger, and so I figured it would be fine, and it was. We got out and back safely. But the day that this happened, I was in charge. I was the captain, and I had someone else on the boat with me and that I was responsible for. And let me tell you, I don't have a captain's license, like I already stated. I've had experience driving boats, and so I felt like based on my skills and knowledge that I was able to to handle the situation safely based on the info that I was given. So we were about to head back to town and the winds pick up, and I had talked to the captain who had a captain's license about the weather conditions. I asked what the waves were like, what the wind was like, and I was told that the waves weren't bad. It was mostly calm out there, but there was like really strong wind gusts, and based on everything I'd done in the past, I knew how to handle wind gusts. So I figured that with the help of my deckhand, we could get back. So I was very hesitant about this, but based on what I was told when I left, I figured it would be okay. So we get on our boat, me and this other girl, and we head out, and it's very, very windy, but I handled it. It's nothing too concerning. And we're in this protected cove in this bay. We turn the corner, and suddenly there's just insane wind gusts, and the boat is just like, it was crazy. And still, that didn't really concern me because the seas weren't that big. It wasn't like crazy waves yet. So we had a few miles, probably like 8 to 10 miles to go, and it supposedly got better the closer to town we got. And so I figured I'll just keep my radio on channel 16, which is the Coast Guard channel. If we have any issues, I'll just radio them, and I will just keep fighting the wind. So we did. We get about halfway out into the bay. Everything is not the greatest conditions, but it's manageable. And that's where things get crazy. So I'm halfway out, and this is why it's important. Halfway between where I was and my home, and the waves pick up. They're just constantly going over. It looks like a freaking washing machine out there. There's just wave stacked after wave, and we're just getting green water over our bow like consistently. And I'm just like fighting for my life here, because I remember that story I told you about like a small boat capsizing in these same conditions. And I was now in the situation with less experience. And I decided at that moment that I needed to turn around and go back, because there was no way I could keep going forward in this condition. So I looked at my GPS and I realized that unfortunately I was halfway out. And either way I went, it was going to be the same distance. And going back to town was going to probably be my safer option, because I'd be closer to boats that could come get me if anything happened. Also, going the way I was currently going towards town, we had a following sea, which I prefer in rough weather like that. Since I don't have a ton of boating knowledge or experience, I don't know why that's better, but I just kind of heard that that was better, and I felt like I shouldn't be trying to turn around in these conditions, because honestly, I could barely keep the boat going into the waves. I didn't want to mess with like turning around and then all that stuff that came with it. So I decided to just keep going to the harbor. Yeah, it was an insane experience. There were no other small boats out there. The only boats that were out there were barges and big tour boats that were making a run for it back to the harbor, because the conditions were so bad. Even for these huge tour vessels, they were just leaving early, going back to town. And so because of that, there weren't very many options for help around me. So what I did was I stayed close to a barge that was going in the same direction, and I figured that I was at least close to another boat. And then all the other tour boats, they were on the opposite side of the bay. They were nowhere near close to me. But I fought the waves, fought the wind. I made it back to the harbor, but my hands were shaking when I got back. We got into the safety of the harbor and the breakwater, and I just like couldn't stop shaking. It was so hard for me to dock that boat when I got back, because I was terrified actually for my life. I was like, the whole time I was thinking while I was driving, I was like, I cannot mess up. This is literally a life or death situation, because for so many people, it was a death situation, even that last summer that I'm talking about. And so I knew there was no room for error, and that kind of just motivated me enough to not worry about my panic and just keep doing things right. And I made it back, and I was so proud of myself, honestly. I love this story, and it was a horrible situation, but it was probably the craziest thing I've ever done, to be honest. And that's what you might get if you do seasonal work. You're gonna get stories, maybe not like mine, because I don't know many people that have stories like that. This was a very interesting situation that I was put into. It felt like there wasn't a lot of like thought from the management put into this. They just kind of put me out there on my own, and it was partly on me because me and my coworker decided to get on that boat in the first place. But like I said, the information we were told changed, because maybe it was fine when the captain was out there last, but the wind and waves definitely picked up. So maybe it's not something that they realized. It could have just happened while I was out there, but it was crazy. And I would love to keep sharing my stories from my life, because I have been living on my own since I was 19. I've been traveling the world on my own for the last few years as well. I've been to 5 continents and 20 countries, I think. I've lived in Alaska for the last 3 years, and I just have so many stories that I will be sharing. Some of them, or I should say most of them, probably won't be this dramatic, but there will still be some really good ones out there. So if you're considering seasonal work, especially in Alaska, I hope you're in for an adventure, because it's an awesome adventure. And these 2 summers that I worked in the small town were probably the most fun of my life, if not also the craziest. But that's kind of what I wanted out of seasonal work, and I had a great time. So thank you for listening to my story, and I'll be posting some more soon.